When I saw my husband scrolling through my phone, my heart skipped a beat, not out of fear of being caught, but because he was about to see those messages. The ones I forgot to delete. I lunged to grab the phone from his hands, but he jerked it away swiftly, his eyes locked on the screen as he kept reading. I watched his face shift, second by second, line by line, and I could feel my life collapsing in real time. Yes, he would find out the truth now. But not the whole truth. His hands trembled as he flipped further, and I knew, any second now he would reach that one message. The one that would destroy everything. The one that explained it all. Or worse, made it more confusing. Then suddenly, my phone vibrated in his hand, and a new notification lit up the screen. I saw the color drain from his face as he read the sender's name. He froze. Didn't even blink. I bit the inside of my cheek, a nervous habit I couldn't shake. My nerves tangled with the raw panic of what I had done. His breathing quickened. I could hear it from across the room. This was the moment I had feared more than anything. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake, the kind that changes absolutely everything. And now, I didn't know what to do. But let me tell you what really happened. Before I reveal the secret I've been hiding so carefully for so long, comment below what city you're watching this from, and tell me, have you ever had a secret you tried so hard to bury, only to have it unravel anyway? The thing about loneliness is that it doesn't always look like crying into a pillow at night. Sometimes, it's the silence between two people eating dinner. The absence of touch. The way no one notices when you buy a new dress or put on perfume. That was my life. And no, I wasn't miserable. That would have been easier, honestly. Misery gives you clarity. What I had was slow erosion, years of brushing teeth side by side without conversation, choosing shows we didn't even like just because they were something to watch, existing under the same roof like polite roommates with shared bills. We used to be different. There was a time when his laugh made me laugh, when we couldn't keep our hands off each other. But over the years, life piled on jobs, aging parents, bills, the daily grind. And somewhere in all that, the space between us widened, quietly, without fights or betrayals. Just indifference. It started on a Tuesday. That detail sticks with me. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because it was so perfectly mundane. I was cleaning out the hallway closet and found a dusty photo album. Inside were pictures from our honeymoon in Barcelona, my hair long and sun-bleached, his arm always around my waist, our cheeks glowing with wine and each other. I stared at one photo for a long time. I remembered how he whispered to me in that narrow alley near the cathedral, how he looked at me like I was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. That night, I showed him the album over dinner. He smiled, said, "Wow, we were so young," and went back to eating. That was it. No conversation. No reminiscing. Just another plate of pasta, another quiet evening. The following weekend, my friend Susan called. She was organizing a company event, a casual thing, nothing fancy, just a way to boost morale. She asked if I'd help coordinate the refreshments and music. "It'll get you out of the house," she said. I hesitated, but she pressed. "You need to have fun again. Remember fun?" So I said yes. It was a Thursday evening. Light rain had tapped all day against the office windows, and everything felt dim and gray. I wore a black blouse I hadn't touched in years, one that used to make me feel something. Alive, maybe. I didn't wear my wedding ring. Not on purpose, but when I noticed it wasn't on my finger, I didn't rush back upstairs for it either. The party was small, cozy, string lights, finger foods, soft jazz playing in the background. People mingled in clusters, holding plastic cups and office gossip. I wasn't expecting to meet anyone new. I wasn't expecting anything at all. But there he was, standing near the coffee machine, slightly disheveled in the way that looks effortless, a tie loosened just enough to signal he didn't take himself too seriously. He introduced himself as the new hire in the creative department. I made a harmless joke about how the coffee machine only works if you whisper sweet nothings to it. He laughed, genuinely, not out of politeness. We talked. Not flirted. Just talked. About travel, books, office quirks. There was something easy about him, like he wasn't trying to impress me, and that somehow made it worse. Or better. I'm still not sure. When I got home that night, my husband was already asleep in the recliner. The TV blared late-night sports commentary. I stood in the doorway for a while, watching the rise and fall of his chest. It wasn't his fault, I told myself. He hadn't changed. Neither had I. We'd just drifted, like two boats unmoored, floating in opposite directions without realizing it. Over the next few days, I thought about the man from the party more than I wanted to admit. I'd catch myself smiling at the memory of his laugh or the way he rolled his eyes when someone spilled punch on the carpet. It wasn't attraction, I told myself. It was novelty. A reminder that I was still seen. Then, on a Monday, I saw him again. This time in the elevator. We were the only two people there, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. Just stood. He broke the silence with a smile and said, still whispering to the coffee machine? I laughed, more than I should have. We started running into each other, at the vending machine, in the break room, near the printers. Always casual. Always short. But something shifted. He'd hold eye contact a second longer than necessary. I'd fix my hair in the reflection of the microwave before walking in. Small things. Insignificant, maybe, but they stacked up, like raindrops filling a cup. One afternoon, I stayed late to finish a report. He walked by, noticed me there, and asked if I wanted a coffee. Only if you sweet-talk the machine, I teased. He brought me one. Black, no sugar, just the way I liked it. I didn't remember ever telling him that. That night, I stood in front of my closet for a long time, staring at my clothes. I wasn't picking an outfit for anything specific. I just wanted to see what I'd wear if I had somewhere to go. Somewhere different. Somewhere exciting. When I slipped into bed beside my husband, he mumbled, "Everything okay?" I whispered yes. But the truth was starting to simmer under the surface. Not a fire. Not yet. Just a slow, creeping heat. And that was the beginning. The moment when my world, so carefully structured and politely muted, began to shift. Not with a bang. But with a glance. A cup of coffee. A memory. The next morning started like any other. Coffee brewing in the background, the low hum of the dishwasher, the click of his spoon against the cereal bowl. I sat across from him in silence, watching steam curl up from my mug. He was scrolling through something on his phone, sports news, probably, and I caught myself looking at the lines on his face. Familiar. Predictable. Safe. And yet, a small part of me wondered if he even noticed that I hadn't worn my ring again. I told myself it didn't matter. That ring had been on my finger for over 2 decades, and no one had ever commented when it wasn't. Not him, not coworkers, not even me. But now, it felt like a silent decision. Like I'd quietly agreed to step outside something sacred, not with a bang, but with a whisper. When I got to work, I felt restless. It wasn't a busy day, but I found excuses to walk around the office more than necessary. My heels tapped down hallways that had never meant anything until now. I wasn't looking for him. Not really. But my eyes searched anyway. I pretended to be reading a flyer on the break room wall when I felt his presence behind me, not footsteps, just that instinctive awareness. Like you know someone's looking at you before you see them. You ever think about switching to tea? He asked lightly. I turned around slowly, managing a half smile. Only when the coffee machine rebels. He laughed softly, and for a moment, we just stood there. Two adults in a fluorescent-lit room pretending that a conversation about beverages was all we needed to say. The moment passed quickly, someone entered, said hello, broke whatever fragile thread had started to spin between us. I left the room, pulse ticking a little faster than I'd admit. That afternoon, it rained. Hard. The kind of rain that makes everything feel heavier, sky, air, thoughts. I stayed late again, more out of habit than necessity, tapping away at my keyboard while the office emptied. Around 6, I heard the familiar squeak of shoes on the tile floor behind me. Still saving the world one spreadsheet at a time, he asked from the doorway. I turned to see him leaning casually against the frame, damp from the rain. His hair was slightly mussed, his sleeves pushed up. I shouldn't have noticed those things. But I did. I shrugged. Deadlines don't wait. He stepped inside, hands in his pockets, looking around as if seeing the office differently at that hour. Do you want a ride? He asked. It's pouring. My first instinct was to say no. Reflex. Safety. But something in me hesitated. It wasn't even about him, not entirely. It was about me. About feeling seen. Feeling like someone thought of me, even in the smallest way. I nodded. Sure. Thanks. His car smelled like rain and faint aftershave. We didn't talk much at first. The windshield wipers kept time with my heartbeat, and I stared out the window, watching city lights blur in the wet glass. My thoughts swirled like the storm outside, calm on the surface, but with undercurrents I couldn't control. At a red light, he looked over. I know this might sound strange, he began, voice quieter than usual, but I feel like I see you. Like really see you. I turned to him, unsure what to say. There was no flirtation in his voice. No seduction. Just truth, clean, simple, unarmored. And somehow, that made it more dangerous. We stopped near my house, the streetlights casting soft glows across the dashboard. The rain softened to a whisper. We didn't speak. We didn't explain. We kissed. And that one moment, brief, unspoken, sliced something open inside me. Not passion. Not rebellion. But something deeper. A recognition. A mirror held up to the woman I had forgotten I used to be. When I stepped out of the car, the air hit me like a wall. Damp. Cold. Real. I walked slowly to the front door, heartbeat still echoing somewhere behind me. The house was quiet. My husband was in the living room, watching a documentary, feet propped up, remote in hand. He looked up, nodded slightly, then turned back to the screen. I stood there for a second longer than necessary, just watching him. Wondering how we got here. Wondering if he ever looked at me and saw me, not just the wife, the cook, the woman who folds laundry, but the person. The woman. Upstairs, I took off my jacket and stared at myself in the mirror. My reflection didn't look guilty. It looked conflicted. Alive in a way that scared me. That night, lying in bed next to him, I kept my eyes on the ceiling. He fell asleep quickly, his breaths slow and even. I listened to them like someone memorizing a rhythm for the last time. My body lay next to his, but my thoughts were somewhere else, in a quiet car, in the smell of rain, in the heat of something I couldn't name. And yet, I felt no triumph. No excitement. Just questions. Why now? Why him? Why did a simple kiss feel like a fault line cracking beneath everything I thought I knew? Sleep didn't come easily. I replayed every second of the evening like a scene I couldn't fast forward. The way he looked at me. The way I let him. The silence that followed. And somewhere in that silence, a realization settled in. This wasn't just about one kiss. It was about what it unlocked. What it reminded me I still craved. Connection. Attention. A sense of matching. The next morning, I woke up before the alarm. I moved quietly, preparing breakfast, laying out 2 mugs, checking my phone without knowing what I was looking for. He hadn't messaged. I didn't know if I wanted him to. My husband joined me in the kitchen, kissed the top of my head, asked if I needed anything from the store. It was normal. Everything was normal. And that normalcy, that practiced rhythm of us, felt like both a comfort and a cage. As I drove to work, my thoughts tangled with guilt, curiosity, and a gnawing awareness that something had shifted. I kept telling myself I could still fix it all. Pretend it never happened. Reinforce the walls. Be better. Stronger. But I already knew. The door had opened. And no matter how tightly I tried to close it, something had already slipped through. The following days blurred into each other like overexposed photographs, the kind where the edges fade and nothing feels quite in focus. I went through the motions: morning coffee, shared silence over breakfast, the drive to work. Everything outside of me moved at its usual pace, but inside, something had shifted. There was a faint but persistent hum beneath my skin, a low-level static that didn't let me rest. At work, I was hyper-aware of my surroundings. My ears picked up his voice even from across the floor. My eyes caught glimpses of him in reflective surfaces, the microwave door, the window behind the printer. It wasn't just anticipation. It was something closer to unease. Like I had crossed an invisible threshold, and now every step forward had to be measured, calculated, weighed. I didn't seek him out. I didn't avoid him either. We hovered in the same radius, orbiting like 2 bodies tethered by something unseen, our proximity unspoken but undeniable. The office didn't help. It was open enough for eyes to wander but closed enough to feel suffocating when watched. And I knew we were being watched. People weren't stupid. They notice patterns. They notice energy shifts. And we had become a shift. There was an older colleague named Janet. She had been with the company longer than most of us, the kind of woman who noticed everything and said nothing unless she wanted to. That week, she started looking at me differently. Her gaze lingered a second longer than usual when I walked into meetings. Her tone changed, not rude, but measured, careful, as though speaking to someone balancing on the edge of something delicate. At first, I tried to tell myself I was imagining it. But then came the questions. "Everything good at home?" she asked casually one afternoon while we stood by the coffee machine. I smiled. Too quickly. "Of course. Why do you ask?" She shrugged. "You just seem elsewhere." Elsewhere. That word stuck with me. I was elsewhere. Not fully here, not fully there. I floated somewhere in between, and the further I drifted, the harder it became to fake normalcy. At home, I tried harder. I cooked his favorite meal one night, roasted chicken with lemon and herbs, the one I used to make when we were first married. He appreciated it. He said it smelled amazing. He complimented the flavors. But when he kissed my cheek afterward, it felt like a courtesy, not connection. I smiled, cleaned the dishes, and wondered why effort suddenly felt like a performance. One night, I found myself standing in front of the mirror again. It had become a strange ritual, assessing the reflection for changes only I could notice. There were no dramatic shifts. Just subtle things. The way my posture had improved. The way I chose blouses with a bit more intention. The way I brushed my hair more slowly, like reacquainting myself with my own presence. He hadn't messaged me since that evening. No texts. No emails. No notes. I told myself that was good. That it meant we were both drawing the line. That we both understood what that moment had been, a crack, not a break. A glimpse, not a path. But still, when my phone buzzed, I hoped. It was on a Thursday that it happened again. We passed in the hallway. A quick nod. No words. But something about the way he looked at me made my breath hitch. He seemed distant. Guarded. Like someone trying to unsee something already etched into memory. Later that day, I caught sight of him at lunch, sitting with the new intern, a bright, sharp girl named Alina who laughed too loudly and touched arms too easily. They were seated close, heads tilted inward, and she was saying something animated. He smiled. Not just polite. Warm. Familiar. I felt something twist in my stomach, not jealousy, exactly. Something uglier. Something shameful. I had no right to feel possessive. No right to feel anything at all. And yet, I did. That night, I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, the fan spinning slowly above me, and tried to unpack the knot in my chest. It wasn't him. It wasn't even the kiss. It was the reflection of something I hadn't faced, the fact that I was no longer enough for myself. That I needed to be seen, wanted, acknowledged. Not by him, not specifically, but by anyone who reminded me I still mattered. The next morning, I wore a dress I hadn't touched in years. Navy blue, fitted at the waist, soft at the hem. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't even new. But it made me feel upright. Present. Whole. I didn't do it for him. I didn't even do it for my husband. I did it for the woman in the mirror who needed proof that she still existed. In the elevator, he stepped in just as the doors were closing. We stood side by side. Close. Too close. The air thickened. He spoke first, his voice low. You look different. I met his eyes. Do I? He hesitated, then nodded. Yes. Like someone who remembered something important. Neither of us said more. When the doors opened, we stepped out and walked in opposite directions. It felt like something had been acknowledged, settled, folded into place, not resolved, but recognized. The rest of the day passed without incident. But when I left the building that evening, I saw him across the street, talking to Alina again. Her laughter cut through traffic, sharp and bright. And he was smiling. I didn't stop walking. I didn't look twice. But as I reached the car and gripped the steering wheel, I realized something. I was angry. Not at him. At myself. For needing his attention to feel validated. For letting someone else's gaze determine my self-worth. For forgetting that I was once whole, even before anyone noticed. That night, I sat on the couch with my husband. We watched a movie. He offered me a blanket. I took it. He didn't ask questions. He didn't notice the change in my silence. And maybe that's what hurt the most. I went to bed early. Stared at the ceiling again. But this time, my thoughts weren't about him. They were about me. About the choices I had made. The ones I was still making. The ones that hadn't yet come. And somewhere in all that stillness, I realized this wasn't about a man. It never had been. It was about waking up. About remembering who I was before the world dulled my edges. And now that I had remembered, I didn't know if I could ever go back. There are days when the world seems to move without you, like you're sitting behind glass, watching life unfold on the other side. That morning was one of them. I went through my routine on autopilot: shower, coffee, mascara, blazer. My hands moved with practiced ease, but my thoughts drifted like fog over a quiet lake, heavy and unresolved. At breakfast, my husband sat across from me, scrolling through his tablet, the way he did most mornings. Occasionally, he'd mention a headline or grumble about traffic. I'd nod, offer the obligatory aha, and sip my coffee. We had perfected this ritual over the years. It was comfortable, even easy. But that morning, it felt like a mask neither of us knew we were still wearing. On the drive to work, I couldn't stop thinking about the conversation in the elevator, the way he said I looked like someone who remembered something important. That phrase lingered, not just because of what it implied, but because I hadn't realized until then how badly I needed to be reminded of anything at all. The irony wasn't lost on me. It took someone else's words to make me listen to my own silence. The weather had shifted again, clouds pressed low against the skyline, casting everything in a pale, washed-out light. I arrived at the office earlier than usual, hoping the quiet would give me space to breathe. It didn't. If anything, the silence made it worse. Every keystroke felt too loud. Every passing footstep, too deliberate. I tried to immerse myself in emails, but the words swam on the screen, meaningless. Around mid-morning, I received a calendar invitation for a client meeting across town. I hadn't remembered signing up for it. The note said joint presentation, logistics strategy. His name was listed too. My stomach tightened, not in panic, but in anticipation. We hadn't spoken beyond pleasantries since the elevator. Maybe this was nothing. Maybe it was just work. We met in the lobby a little before noon. He looked different, not in how he dressed, but in how he carried himself. Calmer, maybe. Or resigned. We exchanged a polite nod, stepped into the car, and set off in silence. The drive was quiet at first, filled only with the sound of city traffic and occasional directions from the GPS. Eventually, he broke the silence. Did you accept this meeting, or did it just appear on your calendar too? I glanced at him. It just appeared. He nodded. I thought so. And then he said nothing more. It was oddly reassuring, the absence of small talk, the shared understanding that we were both trying not to acknowledge what had happened. The office where the meeting was held sat on the 6th floor of a glass building, sleek and modern. We arrived early, checked in, and waited in a quiet corner of the lobby. The air smelled faintly of coffee and printer toner. The receptionist offered water. We both declined. When the meeting began, I threw myself into the presentation with a focus I didn't know I still had. I answered questions, referenced data points, gestured to the slide deck with practiced confidence. He backed me up with perfect timing, adding just enough detail to enhance the pitch without overshadowing it. We were in sync. Efficient. Professional. And yet, beneath it all, there was an undercurrent. An awareness. Every time our eyes met across the conference table, I felt the weight of all the things we weren't saying. Afterward, our client thanked us and left the room, and for a moment, we were alone. He gathered his notes slowly, carefully. That went well, he said. It did, I replied, my voice neutral. He looked at me, and for a brief second there was something in his eyes, regret, maybe. Or restraint. Then he nodded once and walked out. I followed a few seconds later. The drive back was shorter, or maybe it just felt that way. The silence was different this time, not heavy, not tense. Just final. When he pulled up in front of the office, I reached for the door handle, but paused. Thank you for the ride, I said. He looked at me, gave a small, genuine smile. Take care of yourself. It was such a simple phrase. Ordinary. But it landed with surprising weight. Back at my desk, I tried to refocus, but my mind wouldn't cooperate. My thoughts spun around the same question I hadn't dared ask myself out loud: what now? That evening, I walked home. It wasn't something I did often, but I needed the air. The movement. I took a longer route through a nearby park, where the trees were starting to turn gold at the edges. Autumn always crept in quietly, like change disguised as routine. As I passed a couple holding hands on a bench, I felt a strange pang, not envy exactly, but a distant echo of something I used to know. Connection. Intimacy. A kind of unspoken comfort that didn't need to be earned or chased. I used to have that. Or I thought I did. By the time I got home, my husband was already there. He was setting the table, something he rarely did. There was takeout in boxes, Thai food, our old favorite. He looked up and smiled awkwardly. Figured we could do something different tonight. I helped arrange the food, poured water, lit a small candle from the drawer that hadn't seen daylight in years. We sat across from each other, steam rising between us, and ate in near silence. But there was something gentler about it this time. Less routine. More awareness. He asked about my day. I told him about the meeting, the commute, the rain. I left out the elevator. The drive. The glances. Not because I wanted to lie. But because I didn't know how to tell the truth without unraveling everything. Later that night, as we watched a movie together, I leaned my head against his shoulder. It was a small gesture. One I hadn't made in a while. He tensed slightly at first, then relaxed. His hand found mine and squeezed, just once. No words. No questions. When we went to bed, I lay awake for a long time, staring into the dark. Not because of guilt. Not because of desire. But because for the first time in weeks, I didn't know what I wanted. I used to think clarity came from big decisions, from declarations, confessions, breaking points. But maybe it comes in smaller forms. In hesitation. In silence. In the way someone looks at you across a table and you know nothing will ever be exactly the same again. And maybe that's okay. Maybe change doesn't always have to roar in like a storm. Maybe it can arrive gently. Like autumn. Like breath. Like a memory you didn't know you needed until it found you. The following week passed in a strange sort of stillness. Not quiet in the literal sense, there was always noise, keyboards clicking, printers humming, the low murmur of hallway conversations. But the stillness was inside me. A waiting. A lull. As if the universe had paused, holding its breath before something shifted again. At home, things remained unchanged on the surface. We ate dinner. We discussed minor things, weather, errands, his upcoming dental appointment. He asked about work. I answered in half-sentences that sounded complete. I wondered if he noticed how often I looked away when I spoke, how many of my smiles didn't quite reach my eyes. And then Thursday came. The day started like any other. Light traffic, 2 emails marked urgent that weren't, a broken stapler. I had just come back from a meeting when I saw him in the hallway near the elevators, leaning against the wall like he was waiting for something, or someone. He straightened when he saw me but didn't smile. Just nodded. I need to talk to you, he said, voice low. Something in his tone stopped me. It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't warmth. It was the sound of someone carrying something they hadn't figured out how to put down. I followed him down the stairs, past the mezzanine, into the underground garage. It was quiet there, echoing and cool, with only the hum of a vending machine in the distance. He stood near his car, arms crossed, then finally turned to face me. I'm leaving the company. The words didn't register at first. I blinked. What? I got an offer. Out of state. Better position. I've accepted it. I didn't know what I was supposed to say. Congratulations? Good luck? Why didn't you tell me? But all of those felt small, too neat for the tangle of emotions churning under the surface. He looked at me carefully. I didn't plan to tell you like this. Honestly, I wasn't going to tell you at all. But I couldn't just vanish. I nodded slowly. My fingers gripped the strap of my bag tighter than necessary. The garage air felt too cold, like it was seeping through my skin. When? I asked. Monday. That left 2 days. Maybe less. I couldn't decide if that felt merciful or cruel. There was a long pause. Neither of us moved. We were no longer the same people who had shared an elevator, a ride, a kiss. The space between us was filled with things we wouldn't name. He stepped closer, not enough to break boundaries, but enough that I could smell the faint scent of his cologne. You deserve more than stolen moments and gray spaces. I think you know that. I didn't reply. I couldn't. My thoughts swirled too fast, too loud. I felt exposed, raw, like someone had reached into my chest and rearranged the parts. He touched my elbow lightly, briefly. Goodbye. Then he turned, got into his car, and drove off. I stood there long after his taillights had disappeared. My breath fogged in the chill. The vending machine clunked once, then went still again. I took the long way back up to the office. I didn't go to my desk. I went outside instead, into the gray autumn afternoon. The air smelled like leaves and rain, like something ending. I walked for blocks without thinking, just moving, as if distance could somehow flatten the ache in my chest. I stopped at a coffee shop I hadn't been to in years. Ordered a drink I no longer liked just because it used to be my favorite. Sat by the window and watched the world pass by. That night, I didn't tell my husband about the transfer. About the garage. About any of it. I cooked dinner. I smiled. I asked about his day. And when he reached for my hand during a commercial break, I didn't pull away. But I didn't hold on either. Friday came with drizzle and long meetings. My inbox flooded. Deadlines crept. I kept my head down, focused on tasks that didn't require emotion. I didn't see him again that day. Not in the halls. Not in the break room. Not at all. It was like he had already left. Saturday morning, I woke up early. The house was quiet. My husband still asleep, his body curled in the familiar shape beside me. I watched him for a moment, wondering how two people could be so close and so far at the same time. I slipped out of bed, dressed quietly, and left the house without a plan. The city felt different when you weren't rushing through it. I wandered through a bookstore, ran my fingers along spines without reading the titles. I bought a scarf I didn't need. Ate lunch alone at a cafe, letting myself taste each bite instead of inhaling it like fuel. And then, without meaning to, I found myself near the office. I stood outside for a long moment, debating. Then I walked around back, down the stairwell to the garage. His car was gone. Of course it was. But still, I walked to the place where we had stood. It looked exactly the same, concrete walls, painted lines, the blinking light of the vending machine. But it felt different. Emptier. Like something had been taken, not violently, but carefully. Removed, like a picture from a frame. I leaned against the wall, closed my eyes, and let the silence settle. And then, as if on cue, my phone buzzed. It was a message. From him. We kissed. Just those 2 words. No explanation. No preamble. No promise. But it was enough. Not because it reopened anything, but because it acknowledged what had been real. I stared at the screen for a long time before locking it again and sliding it back into my coat pocket. Then I turned and walked away. That evening, at home, I cooked dinner with music playing, something soft, something old. My husband offered to help, and I let him. We moved around the kitchen together like we used to. Small talk. Laughter. Familiar patterns. As we ate, I caught him watching me. Not suspiciously. Not concerned. Just watching. You seem lighter, he said. I smiled. Maybe I am. And maybe that was true. Maybe letting go of the kiss, of the wondering, of the ache, was a kind of freedom. Later that night, lying in bed, I realized something. Not all connections are meant to last. Some enter your life to shake something loose, to wake you up, to remind you that you are still alive. And then, when they've done what they came to do, they leave. Not everything broken has to be fixed. Some things just need to be felt. And released. Sunday arrived with unexpected clarity. The sky was washed in that crisp, early autumn blue that only lasted for a few hours in the morning before fading into gray. I sat by the kitchen window with my second cup of coffee, watching the steam spiral upward, disappearing before it reached anything solid. My husband was still asleep. The house, for once, felt like mine, quiet, uncluttered, still. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to think. But of course, I did. The message from him had stayed in my mind like the aftertaste of something bittersweet. We kissed. That was all. Just 3 syllables that, on paper, meant very little. But in reality, they held a storm. Not of longing or regret, but of acknowledgement. It was as if he had needed to write it out, to make it real before erasing it from his life for good. I didn't reply. I wouldn't. There was nothing left to say. Still, the absence of his presence the next day at work was louder than any conversation. His desk was empty. Cleared. A small box had replaced the usual stack of folders, and his name was gone from the doorplate. Just like that, he had been removed from the frame, the picture rearranged. Nobody said much, but the glances floated in the air, waiting to land somewhere. A few people asked if I'd heard he was leaving. I nodded. Yes. That's all. But it wasn't all. Not really. What followed was an emotional plateau, days that bled into each other without a pulse. My focus at work sharpened, almost aggressively. I volunteered for tasks, stayed late, answered emails at home. I thought if I could fill the space with enough noise, I wouldn't hear the silence pressing in around me. At home, my husband noticed. He made more of an effort, though it was subtle. He began leaving notes on the kitchen counter in the morning, just small things, reminders, jokes, half-scribbled shopping lists with smiley faces at the end. I found myself looking forward to them more than I wanted to admit. One evening, while I was cooking, he stood beside me for a long time, just watching. Finally, he said, "You've been different lately. Quieter. But present." I didn't know how to answer that. Was I present? Or had I just traded one kind of absence for another? I turned down the heat on the stove and reached for the wooden spoon. "Just trying to stay grounded," I said. He nodded, accepting the explanation without pressing. I appreciated that about him, he never pushed when I wasn't ready to talk. But it also meant we often left important things unsaid. That night, I found myself cleaning out the drawer in the hallway. The one filled with old receipts, expired coupons, stray batteries, broken pens. I hadn't touched it in years. As I sorted through the mess, I found an old photo tucked in the back, one from our early years. We were standing on a dock, summer behind us, arms around each other, sun in our eyes. He looked at me then the way he hadn't in years. Or maybe I hadn't looked at him that way in a long time. I didn't know anymore. The line between his distance and mine had blurred. The next day, I received an invitation to a company dinner, an end-of-quarter gathering, casual but mandatory. It was to be held at a restaurant downtown, the kind with white tablecloths and dim lighting, a place that tried to be elegant without being intimidating. I didn't want to go, but I RSVP'd yes. Avoiding things wasn't helping anymore. I arrived just after 7. The restaurant buzzed with laughter, clinking glasses, and the soft drone of conversation. I found my seat near the center, surrounded by colleagues making small talk and sipping wine. Across from me sat a woman I barely knew from HR, beside her, a man from accounting who always wore mismatched socks. It was comfortable in its anonymity. Halfway through the evening, I saw him. Not him, not the one who left, but another. Someone new. Someone I hadn't noticed before. He was standing by the bar, speaking to our director. His expression was warm, engaged, eyes bright. He looked over the room once and, briefly, his gaze landed on me. He smiled. I didn't smile back. Not because I was afraid. But because I wasn't ready. Instead, I turned to the woman beside me and asked her a question about her kids. We talked for 20 minutes about daycare policies, picky eaters, and the stress of school pickups. It wasn't deep. It wasn't thrilling. But it was real. I needed real. When I got home, the house was dark except for the porch light. My husband had left it on, like always. I walked in, kicked off my shoes, and went to the kitchen. On the counter was another note. This one said, "Didn't want to eat without you. Left your dinner in the oven." I stared at it for a long time, fingers resting lightly on the edge of the paper. Then I folded it and placed it in the drawer with the others. Later that night, lying in bed beside him, I reached for his hand under the covers. He stirred slightly, then squeezed mine in response. No words. Just warmth. And that was the moment I realized something had shifted, not with him, not with us, but within me. The ache that had been pulsing in the background for months had dulled. Not vanished, but softened. Like an old bruise finally starting to fade. I didn't know what would come next. I didn't have a plan. But for the first time in a long while, I wasn't reaching for something, or someone, just to fill the silence. I was learning how to sit in it. And listen. Some endings don't arrive with a crash. They arrive gently, like a door left slightly ajar. You don't always notice them until you're already on the other side, and by then, it's too late to ask when the crossing happened. That morning started like any other. My husband was already downstairs, the soft clatter of dishes and the hum of the coffee machine echoing up through the hallway. I pulled on a sweater that smelled faintly of lavender detergent, tied my hair up with little care, and walked down to join him. He greeted me with a warm mug of coffee and a passing smile. Nothing heavy. No questions. Just presence. The kind that once would have been enough for me. Maybe it still was. At work, the air had shifted. The calendar ticked into the new quarter, and the office filled with the kind of forced cheerfulness that always accompanied strategy rollouts and budget meetings. People were polite but tired. Motivated but guarded. I moved through the day like a shadow, attending meetings, offering input, checking boxes. I told myself I was being responsible. Efficient. But in truth, I was distracted. Around lunchtime, I got a message on the internal system, just an initial, a woman from another department, someone I rarely spoke to. She asked if I could help with a presentation template. I agreed, and we scheduled a quick meeting. We met in a small corner office, the kind with a single chair and a round table wedged against the window. She was friendly, disorganized, quick to laugh. Her energy made me feel old and composed in a way I hadn't expected. We talked about fonts, transitions, color palettes. She leaned in at one point and said, "I'm always amazed by how calm you seem. You just have that grounded presence." Grounded. The word clung to me for the rest of the afternoon. It echoed in my head as I typed out reports and responded to emails. Had I become grounded? Was that the same thing as being stuck? Or was it finally stability? At 4 p.m., I received a call. It wasn't from the office. It was from Susan, my friend who had originally invited me to that company party months ago. Her voice on the line was soft, almost hesitant. "He's back in town," she said, without preamble. It took me a second to realize who she meant. When I did, the breath caught in my throat, not out of fear, but surprise. He had moved across the country. Taken a new job. Closed that chapter. Why would he come back? "I thought you should know," she added. "In case." I thanked her. Hung up. Stared at my screen for a full minute before closing my laptop and packing my bag. The walk home was slower than usual. The air was cool, and the city felt larger than normal, like every building loomed just a little taller. I kept thinking of the hallway where we'd first spoken. The stairwell where we met after the meeting. The garage. The rain. The silence after the kiss. I had folded those moments away like old letters, stored in the corners of my memory I rarely dared visit. Now, they floated back up. When I got home, the lights were dimmed, and a familiar scent filled the house, rosemary and garlic. My husband was cooking. He rarely did without prompting. I stepped into the kitchen, and he looked up, smiling. "Thought I'd surprise you." The table was already set. 2 glasses of wine. Cloth napkins. Candles flickering, their flames swaying in the draft from the slightly open window. We sat down, passed plates, exchanged the usual pleasantries. I asked about his day. He asked about mine. And then, as we finished the meal, he cleared his throat. "I booked a cabin," he said, almost shyly. "Just for a weekend. Up north." I thought, maybe it's time we tried to reset. Reset. It was such a hopeful word. So clean, so easy. As if hearts could be cleared like chalkboards, as if the past could be rewritten by changing the setting. I didn't answer right away. I reached for my glass. My hand trembled slightly, not from nerves, but from the weight of too many thoughts. "I think I'd like that," I finally said. He smiled again, slower this time. And something softened in his eyes, like a part of him had been waiting for that answer longer than I realized. Later that night, I packed a small overnight bag, just in case. I tucked it into the closet, hidden behind the coats. Not as a promise, but as a quiet act of willingness. Then, just as I was getting ready for bed, my phone buzzed. No name. Just a number I hadn't saved but still recognized instantly. The message was brief. "I'm outside. Just wanted to see you. One last time." I froze. My breath caught in my chest, and I turned slowly toward the window. I didn't move the curtain. I didn't need to. I could feel him there. Like a ghost. Like memory incarnate. I stood there for what felt like forever, my hand still, my heart not. And I knew, if I walked out that door, everything would change again. But I didn't walk. Instead, I sat on the edge of the bed, closed my eyes, and waited for the sound of footsteps fading down the driveway. And when I finally heard it, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. We spent the night together. But not in the way the words usually mean. We spent the night together in silence, in parallel, in the strange echo of something unresolved. He outside. Me inside. Two people who had once stepped toward something, and now stood firmly on opposite sides of a closed door. In the morning, I opened the curtain slowly. The driveway was empty. No car. No footprints. Just dew on the grass and the pale hush of early light. It was like he'd never been there. Like the message and the presence had been part of a dream, carefully stitched into the fragile fabric of night and then pulled loose with the dawn. I made coffee in silence. My husband was still asleep upstairs. The house felt suspended in time, as if it, too, was holding its breath. I sipped slowly, one hand wrapped around the mug, staring through the window, trying to name the feeling sitting heavy in my chest. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't longing. It was something quieter, almost mournful, a farewell not just to a person, but to a version of myself I had entertained for too long. When my husband came downstairs, he looked tired. Not physically, but in that deep, soul-worn way that settles behind the eyes. We exchanged good mornings, shared breakfast in silence. But I noticed he looked at me longer than usual when I got up from the table. As if he wanted to ask something and didn't know how to begin. That afternoon, I went for a walk. I didn't tell him where I was going. I just needed air. Space. Something to put between myself and the emotion that had been coiling inside me since the night before. The park near our neighborhood was mostly empty, leaves gathering in quiet piles along the walking path. The season had finally tipped into full autumn. Trees shedding their armor. A letting go, slow and deliberate. I sat on a bench near the pond where ducks glided lazily through the water. Everything was so still. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone. The message was still there. I deleted it. Not in anger. Not in haste. Just closure. As I walked home, I tried to replay everything. Not just the kiss. Not just the messages. All of it. The glances. The elevator. The way he made me feel like I existed again. It wasn't about falling in love. It had never been about that. It was about recognition. About feeling mirrored by someone when I'd grown invisible in my own house, in my own skin. But now he was gone, and I was left with the aftermath, not a mess, not a scandal, but a quiet rupture. The kind no one sees but you carry everywhere. At home, I found my husband in the garage. He was going through boxes. Old ones. Holiday decorations, keepsakes, things we hadn't touched in years. When I asked what he was doing, he just said, thought it was time to clean some things out. We didn't talk much that evening. We watched something on television, neither of us really paying attention. He sat close to me on the couch, closer than usual, as if proximity alone could anchor us. I didn't pull away. But later that night, as I lay awake listening to him breathe beside me, I knew something was coming. I felt it in my bones. The inevitability of it. Truth has a way of surfacing, even when you do everything in your power to bury it. And it came the next morning. He was in the kitchen already when I walked in. He didn't say anything at first. Just pushed a folded piece of paper toward me on the table. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was mine. My old notepad. A draft I hadn't meant to leave behind. Words that I had written to clear my head, never to send. Thoughts poured out during one of the many nights I couldn't sleep. I read it once, then again. It wasn't a confession. But it was close. Hints. Phrases. Emotion that had never made it to the surface before. When I looked up, his face was unreadable. "How long?" he asked, voice low. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. He nodded slowly, as if he already knew the answer. Maybe he had known all along. Maybe part of him had sensed the distance and been too afraid to name it. "I don't need all the details," he said. "I just need to know if you're still here. With me." The question struck harder than I expected. It wasn't about forgiveness. It wasn't even about betrayal. It was about choice. Present. Future. Us. "I don't know," I whispered. And it was the truest thing I'd said in weeks. He didn't get angry. He didn't shout. He just stood up, walked to the sink, and began rinsing his coffee mug. Later that day, I found my suitcase by the bedroom door. It wasn't packed. It wasn't a threat. It was a question. I didn't leave. Not right away. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, hands clasped, feet motionless on the carpet. I thought of everything, how we used to be, how we had changed, what we had stopped saying. I thought of the silence that had grown between us like ivy, winding around everything, slowly choking the light. Eventually, I stood up and opened the closet. I didn't pack. But I didn't put the suitcase away either. That night, we didn't eat dinner together. He said he had a late meeting. I said I wasn't hungry. We moved through the house like strangers borrowing space. Before bed, he stopped in the doorway. "I just need to know if you're trying," he said quietly. "I'm trying," I replied, meaning it even if I wasn't sure what trying looked like anymore. He nodded. Walked away. I lay awake again, this time with a different kind of ache. Not the ache of desire. Not of guilt. But of loss. Of something slipping through fingers that had held on too loosely for too long. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I just watched the ceiling and wondered what part of me had been missing all this time, and whether I had lost it or given it away. There's a heaviness that comes with silence, not the kind you choose, but the kind that settles between two people like dust in a long-abandoned room. The days after the suitcase sat by the bedroom door were some of the quietest we'd ever shared, not because we were angry, but because we didn't know what to say anymore. We were careful with each other. Too careful. Like people stepping over the cracks in old wood, hoping not to fall through. I woke earlier than usual on Thursday. The sun hadn't fully risen, but the soft gray light coming through the blinds painted the walls in muted streaks. My husband was already up, judging by the absence of his weight on the mattress. I stayed in bed for a while, staring at the ceiling. There were lines there I hadn't noticed before, small imperfections, faint watermarks. How many mornings had I missed them? How many other things had I stopped seeing? When I finally came down, the kitchen was empty. A half-full mug of coffee sat on the table, steam long gone. A folded note lay beside it. Just a short sentence, gone early. Back late. Nothing more. No signature. But it didn't need one. The distance was signing everything for us now. I moved through the day mechanically, emails, short meetings, leftover lunch eaten standing by the copier. No one at work noticed anything off. Or if they did, they didn't ask. That was the strange thing about suffering quietly, it made others comfortable. That afternoon, I wandered into the old storage room at the office, looking for a binder I didn't need. It was quiet there, the kind of silence that wasn't just absence of sound, but the kind that felt removed from time. The kind that lets thoughts swell. I stood there for a long time, one hand resting on the filing cabinet, breathing in the faint scent of dust and forgotten paper. It struck me then how tired I was, not physically, but emotionally. Exhausted from pretending to be okay. From carrying two versions of myself, the one who had made a mistake, and the one who still didn't know what to do with the truth of it. I wasn't asking for a grand epiphany. I just wanted peace. A moment of certainty. Something to plant my feet in again. When I got home, the suitcase was gone. I stopped in the hallway, staring at the empty space by the wall. I wasn't sure if I felt relief or loss. I checked the closet. It was back in its usual place, nestled behind the coats, zipped and untouched. A message. Subtle. But clear. Later that evening, we ate dinner in silence again. But this time, something about it felt less strained. He poured me a second glass of wine. I accepted. Afterward, he turned on music in the living room, something soft and slow. And when he sat beside me, he didn't reach for my hand. He didn't say anything at all. But he didn't move away either. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind rustled outside, pushing against the windows with quiet insistence. I lay awake, staring into the dark, thinking of all the things I'd wanted to say. That I was sorry. That I had felt forgotten. That I had forgotten myself. That none of it had been planned. That I still didn't know how to forgive myself, let alone ask for forgiveness from someone else. Eventually, I got up and wandered into the kitchen. I stood there for a while, palms pressed against the cool countertop. And then, without meaning to, I pulled open the drawer and took out the old notebook, the one I'd written in the night before everything started to fall apart. I flipped to the last page and began writing again. Not a confession. Not an explanation. Just words. Raw and unfiltered. I wrote about the distance, about the quiet, about the ache that had grown in the spaces we used to fill with laughter. I wrote about the bench in the park and the man who saw me for a moment and left. I wrote about how hard it was to face someone who hadn't done anything wrong except stop seeing me. I didn't write to be understood. I wrote to feel lighter. In the morning, I left the notebook on the kitchen table. I didn't say anything about it. I just left for work, letting the silence speak in my absence. That day at the office, a strange calm settled over me. Like I had finally stopped clinging to both shores of a river and allowed myself to be carried by the current. I still didn't know where it would take me. But for once, I wasn't afraid of the not knowing. On my lunch break, I stepped outside. The air was crisp. The trees had turned fully now, leaves falling like gold and rust. I sat on a bench near the edge of the courtyard and watched people pass, strangers moving in and out of their lives, carrying groceries, holding coffee, talking into phones. Each one with a story. Each one trying. That weekend, I suggested we go for a drive. No destination. Just away from the house. From the routine. From the expectations. He agreed without hesitation. We drove for hours through back roads and quiet towns. We didn't talk much. But we didn't need to. The radio played old songs, some we remembered, some we didn't. I watched the trees blur by and let the motion do what words couldn't. At some point, he pulled into a rest stop by a lake. We got out. Stretched. Stood by the water in the fading light. And then, without prompting, he said, "I read what you wrote." I didn't reply. He glanced at me. "Thank you." It was the first time in weeks he had looked at me without hesitation. And something in me loosened, just a little. We didn't solve anything that day. There were no promises, no sudden answers. But there was something else. A beginning. Not the kind you celebrate. But the kind you protect. Quietly. Gently. Like a flame cupped in your hands, sheltered from the wind, hoping it's enough to keep you warm. There's a moment in every story when you realize it's the end, even if no one says it out loud. It doesn't arrive with a grand gesture or a dramatic finale. Sometimes, it's just a quiet knowing. A shift in weight. A door that doesn't close the way it used to. That moment found me on a Tuesday morning, standing in the kitchen, watching the toaster slowly brown 2 slices of bread I wasn't even sure I wanted. The air smelled like routine, coffee, fabric softener, old wood. My husband sat at the table, flipping through a newspaper neither of us subscribed to anymore. It had been left on our porch by mistake, and yet he read it like it belonged there. I buttered the toast slowly, listening to the soft crinkle of pages, the occasional clearing of his throat, the tick of the old clock above the sink. When I set the plate on the table, he looked up. We exchanged a glance. Nothing was said. But something passed between us, a recognition, perhaps. That we had survived something. Or that we were still standing in the ruins, quietly deciding what to do with them. I went to work with the same mechanical rhythm I'd developed over the past few weeks. My desk was tidy, my inbox managed. No one asked about the time I had taken off the week before. Everyone assumed I'd been traveling or attending to family matters. The truth was less tidy. I had spent 3 days alone by the coast in a rented room with no television, walking barefoot on cold sand, trying to listen to my thoughts. That trip hadn't offered answers. But it offered space. And space, I was learning, was its own kind of healing. Now, back in the fluorescent hum of the office, I moved through the day with measured calm. I found comfort in the small tasks, editing a proposal, color-coding a presentation, sending polite emails. Each completed task felt like stacking a brick. One more piece of stability. One more attempt to build something out of the shapeless. At lunch, I sat outside on the concrete bench, watching wind shuffle leaves across the parking lot. A coworker joined me briefly, talked about her daughter's piano recital, then left to take a call. I didn't mind the solitude. It was different now. Less empty. More chosen. When I returned to my desk, there was a small envelope tucked under my keyboard. No name. Just my initials on the front. I opened it carefully. Inside was a single card, blank except for one sentence handwritten in blue ink. You didn't disappear. There was no signature. But I knew who had written it. I held the card for a long moment, fingertips pressing into the paper. The words weren't an invitation. They weren't a plea. They were a gesture. A mirror held up to something I hadn't known I needed to see. That despite everything, the silence, the choices, the breaking, I had remained. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just breathed. When I got home that evening, the suitcase was gone from the closet again. This time not by mistake. Not as a symbol. Just gone. In its place were 2 coats hung neatly side by side. Mine and his. Our shoes still lined up. Our toothbrushes still in the same cup. He was in the backyard when I stepped out to find him. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the grass. He was trimming the small tree near the fence, the one that had grown wild the past few years. He looked up as I approached. I didn't know you were back, he said. I needed some air, I replied. We stood there for a moment, not awkward, just still. I think I'd like to repaint the kitchen, he said after a while. Feels like it's needed it for years. I nodded. Yeah. It could use a new color. Neither of us mentioned what the conversation was really about. It didn't need to be named. We were talking about change. About staying. About choosing. That night, I lit a candle on the nightstand. I couldn't remember the last time I had done that. The small flame flickered softly, casting shadows that danced across the ceiling. My husband read beside me, glasses low on his nose. I wrote in my notebook, not about him. Not about anyone. Just about breath. Trees. The color of the sky before dusk. I fell asleep with the window cracked open and a blanket wrapped around me, a draft brushing my face like a quiet reminder that I was still here. That I hadn't disappeared. The next morning, I woke before the alarm. The house was silent, bathed in early light. I sat up slowly, looked around the room, then reached for the small drawer in the nightstand. Inside was the folded envelope with the card from yesterday. I read the words again. You didn't disappear. And I believed it. I walked to the mirror, met my own eyes, and didn't look away. There were lines there, soft and deep. Evidence of years lived, mistakes made, love given, love lost, truths hidden, truths faced. It was all there. Etched in skin, in muscle, in gaze. I stepped back, exhaled, and let it all be. Then I went downstairs, poured 2 cups of coffee, and carried them to the table.